Greetings, friends around the world. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Bible News Prophecy Channel. Will the nation of Mexico ever regain territories that are now controlled by the United States? Does that really sound far-fetched? Well, I want to go through some reasons why it's not as far-fetched as you might think. One of the things that triggered this was that last night in Colorado, there were 1,000 to 2,000 demonstrators, and they were protesting U.S. immigration policies, amongst other things. And one of the things that they did was took down the American flag, and they put up the Mexican flag. Now, flags represent a nation, sovereignty, and some of you may wonder, well, why would somebody put up a Mexican flag in Colorado? Well, years ago, actually over 11 years or so ago, 12 years ago, I guess it was, there was this ad put out by Absolut Vodka. And we'll show you a picture here that showed in an absolute world. And if you look at this particular map in some depth, you're going to see what was the United States, a good part of it is controlled by Mexico. Now, they did this because within Mexico, there's been this concept called the reconquista, or the reconquering, or basically taking back the lands that the United States took from Mexico after 1848. Now, you might say, well, that was a long time ago. We don't ever have to worry about anything like this. Nothing like this could ever happen. Well, for a long time, various ones in Mexico have considered the United States to be an enemy nation. And since the prominence or the rise of U.S. President Donald Trump, and while he was presidential candidate, Donald Trump, various things have gone on. And I'd like to read something that Zero Hedge reported came from a former president of Mexico, Vicente Fox, regarding to Donald Trump, who was then a candidate for the U.S. presidency. Fox went as far as to warn Trump not to play around with Mexicans, and that if the rhetoric keeps up, it could literally lead to war. And then, literally, what it said that Fox said was, "We're coming back to the era of the ugly American. The gringo was hated all around the world. And this guy, pretty soon, he got the title. He is the ugly American. He is the hated gringo because he's attacking all of us. He's offending all of us. Imagine, that this could lead to war, not to a trade war." So he's talking about the idea of an actual literal war. Now, that sounds offensive to people, of course, and we don't want to see wars. But is it something like that could ever happen? Well, earlier this month, the Los Angeles Times basically said, and let me actually read this, "Trump's tactics, particularly if continued, are likely to have long-term consequences for the U.S.-Mexico relationship." And it's talking about tariffs, migrant policies, etc. Now, many Mexicans have been very concerned that the United States, under U.S. President Donald Trump, has basically been bullying Mexico. Many are upset about the conditions that migrants are being housed in the U.S. and various other policies. And this is feeding long-standing hostilities. And many Mexicans believe that the U.S. improperly took lands such as most or all of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Colorado. And many believe they're entitled to that land back. Sound far-fetched? Well, the Bible has a prophecy in Daniel chapter 11, verse 39, that we're going to go to in just a moment. I'll read from the New King James Version of the Bible. And we're talking about a power who's also referred to as the King of the North, who'll be a Germanic leader who's going to basically be in charge of Europe. And look at something that he does. Daniel 11, verse 39. "Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain." So notice, this is a war from a European power, Germanic power, Germanically dominated power, and it's going against the strongest fortresses. Well, the land of the strongest fortresses in the 21st century is the United States of America. And notice that he wins, and he divides the land for gain. Well, he's going to divide the land. Various ones over the last few decades have suggested at some point in time Mexico may end up with some land from the United States. Now, this is going to happen during the time of Jacob's trouble, which you can read about Jeremiah 30, verse 7, also known as the Great Tribulation that Jesus mentioned in Matthew 24, verse 21. This is going to be a time, according to what Jesus said in Luke 21, 24, it's going to be the times the Gentiles are fulfilled. Well, the Mexicans are Gentiles. Now, does this all seem preposterous to happen in this century? Well, actually, if you go back at the history, I ran across something a couple of years ago that talked about something that happened about 100 years ago. About 100 years ago, the U.S. officially declared war on Germany for World War I. But at first they didn't want to do this. President Woodrow Wilson said he didn't want to get in war. As a matter of fact, one of his campaign slogans to get him elected or reelected was, "He kept us out of war." Now let me read an article here from the Federalist. But two events would change everything and force Americans to accept what they could no longer avoid would have become a global conflict. The first was Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare on passenger and merchant ships. The second was the Zimmermann Telegraph, which revealed Germany's attempt to forge a secret alliance with Mexico against the United States, promising to help Mexico recover territory it had ceded to the United States following the Mexican-American War in 1848. So we see the idea of a Germanic power making a deal with Mexico against the United States to give land actually is something that the Germans were serious about over 100 years ago. And when we look at biblical prophecy, we see there's reasons to believe that they will be serious about it again. Now, as far as some things that have been going on with the United States, Europe, and Mexico, I'd like to read a couple of things that I wrote back in 2008. Many of the standards of the European Union will be adopted by nearly all the countries of the world. However, over time, it will become increasingly clear that the British will be in more agreement with the Canadians and Americans, that the European Union in more agreement with the Mexicans than the EU will have with the English-speaking nations. And we've seen, for example, with the rise of U.S. President Trump and Brexit over in the UK, a split between the continental Europeans, basically, the United States and the UK. Now, I also wrote, back in 2008, trade wars and or serious trade disputes will most likely arise. The EU will decide that Mexico and the rest of Latin America are more in agreement with it, and thus make some type of serious trade agreement with most or all of Latin America. So that's something that I wrote back in 2008. Now, if you don't think we can see this happening, a pivot toward Europe and away from the United States by Mexico, I saw something related to trade. Politico had this headline: Mexico's U.S. trade deal lands a punch on Trump. So the Mexicans and the Europeans did make a trade deal, a serious trade deal. Changes are actually happening. Now, the EU Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, a few weeks ago made an announcement about a deal between parts of Latin America and the European Union. And this is with the Mercosur bloc of South America, and that would be Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And he said the historic deal was sending a strong signal, calling it the largest trade agreement the EU had ever concluded. Well, if you look at the number of people in the Mercosur countries, plus you add Mexico, which has a separate deal, then what I wrote back in 2008, we're seeing it. The Europeans have made, or in the process of concluding, significant deals with most of Latin America. Now, the Bible prophesies in Ezekiel 27, verses 12 to 24, as well as in Revelation 18, that the Europeans are going to be a major trading power. And in Ezekiel, it's actually referring to people who seem to be Spanish-descended peoples in Latin America. Now, people such as U.S. President Donald Trump and various other government officials don't seem to appreciate or understand biblical prophecies related to the United States, Europe, or Latin America. Now, in the short run, certainly the United States can keep pressuring Mexico to do things that it doesn't want to do. But if you look at biblical prophecy and you see what's going on, you can see that the United States is risking turning Mexico from sort of an ally to a true enemy. And various ones have declared that Donald Trump could actually start a real war. Decades ago, I came up with this idea that the Mexicans would one day help the Europeans against the United States. I still believe that's going to happen, and it's getting closer. The flag removal was just one more sign that there are people who are interested in having Mexico regain territories that are currently part of the United States, but they were once part of Mexico. So, do I believe that any territories currently controlled by the United States are going to have with Mexico? Yes. I believe the Bible teaches it. I believe that's consistent with what many want to do. I also believe it's consistent with Daniel 11:39. Now, while I understand why most people think this is a crazy idea, we are seeing right now major trading blocks going on, trading deals with Europe and Latin America, as well as other deals and other situations that the United States is turning allies around the world into enemies. Biblical prophecies are going to come to pass. The United States is going to lose land. And yes, I believe Mexico will end up with some of the territories, maybe even all the territories they once lost to the United States. Because that's my understanding what this book is teaching us, and we can see that consistent with world events. This is Dr. Bob Thiel, the Bible News Prophecy Channel.